Well, good morning. Thank you to David and Jeff for the invitation to speak, and it really is a pleasure to be here today because this really is an important topic. I don't think the issue really is disaggregation per se. I would frame it up as what's the right path to the future. Really, you know, I think it's undeniable that we live in a very dynamic, unpredictable, and dangerous world, and it's an imperative that that we adapt to that environment. And so, to me, it's a given that as we look to the future, we're going to have to make changes to our national security space architecture. The question is, what's the right path for how to get there? How do you transition from where you are to where you want to be? And I think there's, not surprisingly, a lot of commonality with respect to the identification of what people perceive as problems. There's clear disagreement about what are the cause of those problems and the solutions to those problems. And my comments are really going to focus in on that to try and provide some context and some framework here. So, as I mentioned, there are clear imperatives for change. Domestic fiscal constraints are going to provide us with less resources to allocate to the national security space business and sustain current architectures. And obviously there are foreign weapon systems that are being deployed or have been deployed that are posing threats to both U.S. and friendly space assets. And space is, once again, a contested operating environment. And so it's important that as we move to the future, that we deliver capabilities that are more affordable, more resilient, more agile, and more capable. I think if we do that, we'll sustain the strategic advantage that the United States has enjoyed for many decades now, that we've been able to leverage to provide, you know, enhance our prestige, our influence abroad, you know, our prosperity and our security. And sustaining that leading position, I think, is where we ought to be able to agree that that would be a good thing to do. The cautionary note is, you know, make sure that you're actually doing things that are going to do that, because there's not a lot of resources to go around, as people have already mentioned. We're not going to get too many swings at the ball in order to get it right. And what we don't want to do is cede that strategic position and the advantages that we've accrued as a result of buying into concepts or faddish ideas that essentially are you know, questionable assertions or unsubstantiated claims about what they're going to bring for you. There really needs to be some analytic rigor brought to this process so that alternative approaches and different solutions can be assessed, so that rather than what I think we've seen in the public policy debate thus far, which is people throwing assertions out, you know, basically I think everybody's entitled to their opinion, but not their own set of facts. We ought to get to a common set of facts, so we have a basis for informing the debate and enabling the people that we've entrusted with making the decisions about how to get to the future with the sound basis for doing so. Let's see, space architectures. I think we can all agree that space architectures ought to be designed to deliver the capabilities and effects required to execute missions. I think by narrowly focusing on space, though, we're missing the point, because space architectures are part of or should be thought of as being a part of the broader context of cross-domain mission architectures. And, you know, you run the risk of sub-optimizing by focusing exclusively on the space piece, or even just the orbital segment of that piece, which is a lot of the discussion that you've heard thus far. We should be thinking about it holistically, comprehensively, at an enterprise level, in terms of what's required to accomplish the mission. And if you step back and think about some of these missions in context, you're going to recognize that many of them already are reflected by architectural approaches that are distributed, proliferated, and even disaggregated. So, spacecraft size. Although the comment was made, this really isn't about small satellites. I think what we've seen in the debate thus far is, that large multi-mission spacecraft have been put forward as, aha, that's the cause of the problem. The vicious cycle that people, assert we're in with respect to acquisition are all caused by the fact that we are pursuing large, complex, multi-mission spacecraft. Well, let's set that aside. Spacecraft size is really a function of validated requirements subject to the laws of physics and economics. There's reasons why some spacecraft to perform missions have to be larger. There's reasons why some can be smaller. We have no fondness for small, medium, large. Lockheed Martin has built systems across the spectrum. It really is a function of what's the right thing to do based on the requirements in physics and economics. And I think we should all be in favor of whatever architectural approach best serves the mission. So let's talk about that. I think I agree with my colleagues when they say one size does not fit all. I certainly don't believe that during the Cold War, an emphasis on the strategic nuclear deterrence mission resulted in a single approach to spacecraft. In fact, we had a variety of architectural approaches and spacecraft sizes as part of the national security architecture throughout the Cold War. When you look at both what we've done with respect to defense space missions and intelligence space missions. So aggregation of multiple missions on a platform, I think as Peter already mentioned, has been done in the past because it's been economical. It requires, a single platform, less launchers, and less command and control on the ground. And as Peter also mentioned, there's both deterrence and resilience benefits to aggregation. Putting strategic nuclear deterrence missions and other missions on the same platform complicates an adversary's risk calculus. They don't know what's going to happen if they attack a satellite. They're going to run the risk potentially of nuclear escalation. Now, it also could make it more difficult for the United States to understand the intent behind that attack if a satellite with aggregated missions is the object of affection. So it cuts both ways. And I think Peter mentioned that there are pros and cons to both approaches. Disaggregation, and I think we do ourselves an injustice when we don't precisely define our terms. Disaggregation to me is the separation of missions onto separate platforms. It's not synonymous with distributed architectures or proliferated architectures. You can be distributed and proliferated and be aggregated at the same time. There's nothing that says that in fact, we have been in the past in many different architectures, simply by being more robust, launching on schedule, fleshing out the constellations. There's ways to do that without having to go to a completely different architectural approach. So we need to be clear about what it is we're really talking about and what are the benefits from different architectural approaches. But I don't believe the terms are synonymous, and we shouldn't use them that way. I think to the contrary to my colleagues on either side of me, the assertion that disaggregation is going to be less expensive is an assertion that needs to be proven. It seems to me that more platforms will require more launches and more command and control, and perhaps move the complexity from space to ground. And it's arguable that it's going to save money. It's also arguable, as I mentioned before, that it's going to improve deterrence or resilience. Disaggregating strategic nuclear missions and other missions onto separate platforms, to the contrary of aggregation, may ease the risk calculus, may make it less complicated for an adversary to make a decision about whether to attack a particular platform. On the one hand, it may strengthen a red line against attacking satellites that are performing the strategic nuclear command and control or early warning missions. On the other hand, it may make it easier for them, because they're not running real risks of nuclear escalation, to attack satellites that are not performing those strategic nuclear missions. So I think we need to be very clear about what do we think we're going to get by taking one architectural approach or another. Now, as I mentioned, I think you can distribute value across platforms and proliferate the number of platforms, and arguably that will improve resilience and deterrence. But all of this is going to depend on a host of factors, some of which include the adversary's targeting capability, their method of attack, the probability of kill of the attack mechanism, and the cost exchange ratio. With all due respect, Josh, I'd say that an adversary that has a competent and capable and reasonable arsenal of bullets it's going to be just as easy to attack 2 vehicles as it is 10. The only difference is perhaps minutes or hours of additional endurance on orbit. That may be some benefit, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that a determined adversary couldn't go after 4 vehicles or 10 vehicles as easily as they could go after 2 vehicles. And this is analytically provable, and there are folks in the department and the intelligence community who've already done so, and I'll encourage you to go pull the string and get the classified briefs. Let's talk a little bit about acquisition. By going back to basics, we've really gotten over the hurdles of many of the issues in development, and we're now into production. We've sort of avoided the problems of the past by taking an incremental evolutionary approach to tackling the problem. I believe it's probably a wise and prudent approach to move to the future by sustaining this evolutionary approach. EASE was, I think, a good idea. The capability improvement program that was part of EASE was also a very sound idea, and it gets fundamentally to the sorts of questions that my colleagues raised with respect to technology insertion. It was intended to have a long-term roadmap that was appropriately funded to provide the opportunity within the context of the mission to identify technologies and bring them to maturation and have on-ramps where those technologies could be inserted into the mainline programs. Instead, what's happened, unfortunately, is most of that money has been siphoned off, and so the benefits of the EASE concept, where there were block buys and other things that were intended to help stabilize the industrial base, make the acquisition process more predictable and regular, we're not really getting all of the leverage out of that as we can. Again, you know, I'd encourage you to go back and look at the defense industrial base studies that the CAPE did. You know, the idea didn't come out of the whole cloth. It was done looking empirically at, you know, the collective experience of the national security space community. I mean, I'm sure you've all seen the charts that show here are the programs in the lower left corner of the box that have been performing well, and here's the scatter plot of the programs that haven't. And I think they did a very commendable job of identifying what were the reasons why certain programs performed well and other programs did not. And it didn't really have much to do with respect to spacecraft size or the architectural approach involved. It had to do with a variety of other things, and you know, there's a forest of trees that have been felled to produce the volume of acquisition studies that can tell you what are the best practices. I think we're all interested in shortening the length of program cycles. You know, everybody understands, I believe, that a relatively small percentage of a satellite program is producing hardware. The real cost driver is span time times labor. And so if you want less expensive programs, you should build and design programs that allow you to get to a reasonable span time with the right amount of labor to produce and integrate and test and deliver the capability. It's, you know, some of this really isn't all that difficult. It's really the failure to recognize that the issue is less about what we're buying and more about how we're buying it. For affordability, that's really the key. We ought to be having a conversation about how are we buying things. The government is a monopsonist and a monopsony. There's one buyer and many sellers. There's an inordinate amount of power in that monopsonist to be used. The federal acquisition regulations and policy guidance issued in the Defense Department and the intelligence community provides all the flexibility in the world to use the tools and authorities that are available to buy things smartly, and as taxpayers, I'm sure you'll all agree with me that what we want is people who are incentivized to use our scarce, increasingly scarce resources as efficiently and effectively as possible. We need to get to those shared and common incentives on both sides of the equation, because industry builds systems to the validated set of requirements and within the contractual framework and terms and conditions, established by its government customers. One other point on affordability that I'd like to make is the notion of these alternative concepts, I think, is valid. We should always be open to good ideas. But we shouldn't just be making assumptions about what costs are. And Peter alluded to one variable in the cost equation, which was the total ownership cost or the life cycle cost. But there are other variables of cost that actually need to be understood. Launch costs, the transition costs, the ground costs, integration costs. All of these cost factors or variables need to be assessed in terms of understanding what's the relative expense involved in one approach as opposed to another approach. By isolating things, or just looking at the space vehicle, but not the entire system, including how to launch it, the user segment, you're not getting a total picture. And so, we actually ought to be understanding each part of that equation and where it comes out in total, so that we're not fooling ourselves and we're not being penny wise and pound foolish and saying, okay, we can save some near-term dollars, but over the long term, we're going to pay 2 or 3 times as much. I think I'd issue a similar cautionary warning with respect to transitioning. Transitioning precipitously to alternative approaches without having done the homework, without having done the transition planning, without really understanding what it is that you want to achieve, first and foremost, and understanding how much it costs and all of the ins and outs of that transition is fraught with peril, both operationally and financially. I think we've seen that in the past. It's there's an empirical basis for that assertion. Let me wrap up by saying I think we will all agree that the United States has a vital national interest in helping to protect the freedom of space because of its importance to commerce, trade, and our security. And we should step back and recognize that because the post-Cold War environment is what it was, and the 21st century environment has new threats emerging, and we're again in a contested environment, it doesn't mean that we should disinvest in space. It means, like the land, sea, and air, we're going to be having to do the sorts of things that we've done in every other medium in order to be able to pursue our national interests and protect them. Fundamentally, we're going to have a deterrent strategy, probably with, that involves both threats, denial and punishment, and a layered defense in depth that assures that we can actually deliver the capability and the services to the commander-in-chief and the warfighters and other users as and when it's needed. But the discussion of resilience, while it's really important and timely, it has been hampered thus far by, finally we have a definition, but what's been lacking is we don't have any metrics. We don't have any ways of measuring resilience in order to be able to evaluate one approach compared to another. And so we've undertaken on our own nickel to actually develop those metrics and to have a quantifiable approach for how to be able to evaluate it. And we're assessing both the baseline architecture, the as-is architecture for today, program of records, and a range of plausible candidate solutions so that we can understand where are the needs and the curves, and what are the right mix of capabilities so that we can be more resilient, more agile, more capable, and understand cost as an independent variable in that equation, so we can understand how to get the best value for the constrained resources that we're going to have in the current time frame. So with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.